I'm going to show you this one free tool that I use a lot in my watercolour painting. And at the end of this tutorial, I'm going to show you the different paintings where I've used the plastic card. It can be an old bank card. This is my AA card. I've been sent a new one, so this one has expired. And I'm just cutting it with the scissors, and I'm cutting different sizes, and this will really help me with my watercolours. So some will have long sort of sides that I can print longer marks with, and others I'll have shorter sort of sides, and I can use it for much more detail stuff and actually dip straight into my pans. A lot of the times with my pans, I'll squeeze out freshly squeezed paint and I'll use that to print with, and I'll show you later how I do that in this tutorial. And as you can see here, I use the sort of flat side here, but I also use the point of the plastic card as well. So it's so useful and versatile and free. So let's get started showing you how I use the techniques that I use with this plastic card. So what I'm doing here is I'm using my size 8 brush and I'm mixing up some burnt umber at the top, a little bit of yellow ochre there, some ultramarine, and I'm going to use some indigo. If you want some colour alternatives, check out the description below. I'm just sort of drawing in some rocks. When I first started using a plastic card, I used to use it a lot for painting rocks. So what I'll do is I use this sort of creamy paint. Don't use the paint too watery, it doesn't work as well. So you want sort of a milky mixture, and I'm just painting the lightest colour, the yellow ochre, first. And if you notice, I've left a little bit of light on the top of the rocks on the right hand side. I'm now dropping in the burnt umber, wet into wet, leaving that yellow ochre at the top, so it's sort of 50-50, and then dropping in a little bit of the ultramarine and the indigo, the darkest paint, at the bottom there, wet into wet. So I'm going to let that dry off a bit. I don't want to use the plastic card too early, it doesn't work as well. So you still want a sheen on your piece of paper, on your watercolour paper, but you don't want it too wet. So I'm just doing this freehand now. For those of you that want to be a little bit more loosened up, I'm doing exactly the same thing but without the outline drawing. Sometimes it's quite nice to be spontaneous and not have outlines to sort of restrict you a bit. So I'm going to use the side of the card now to swipe off the watercolour paint, and I've waited for the top one to dry off a bit. Now you can still see there's a sheen there, and I'm just sort of almost like a windscreen wipe. I'm sort of swiping. You can see here, I'm going to demonstrate that there. Swiping. Do it quite swiftly and don't labour it. Don't go back and forth, because you can tear your paper and it can look quite muddy. It does take practice, but it's so much fun to do. So do have a little practice. So as you can see here, I'm swiping just once in an area, and then again I'm showing you there swiping, and just going right around and almost just sort of lifting off the paint as you do it. Do it quite swiftly and smoothly. It's so much fun. It's fun practicing, and you can actually swipe off smaller detail rocks as well. If your paint has dried too much, as the one on the left has here I'm pointing to, just re-wet it gently again and then leave it again till the shine goes off a bit. What I'm showing you here is using very watery paint and going in too soon, and as you can see there, you don't get the darks and you don't really get that lovely contrast that you get with the milky paint using darks and waiting for that right moment. So I've gone in again on the rock that had dried and I've re-wetted. It does work, but not as well as going in first of all. So really sort of make sure you go in at the right time, and that's when the shine is still on the paint but it's sort of drying off a bit, and it's really worth practicing so you get the instinct to know when the right time is. Now I'm going to use the corner of the cards, the sharp corner and the rounded corner. So I'm actually painting some light green cadmium yellow with some ultramarine and a little bit of burnt umber to make a mid green here, and I'm going to use some of the indigo as well to make a dark green. So it's quite a nice way of painting grasses. So while that's drying off a little bit, waiting for that sort of window of opportunity to lift off, I'm actually painting sort of a flat area of grass. So light, mid and dark green here as well. So here's my opportunity. I'm using the corner, the sharp corner of the card as I'm pointing to here, and I'm lifting off quite swiftly to reveal thin white lines. So I'm lifting off that watercolour paint. So now I'm going to use the rounded corner of the plastic card and do the same thing, lifting off swiftly, and you get sort of larger marks, larger grasses. So it really is an effective tool for creating and painting grasses. You can see a close up here. If it's too wet, the paint all runs back in on itself, so just wait a few more minutes. So again, here is the flat wash, and what I'm doing is I'm using the corner of the card to begin with those lovely thin white lines. You can see I'm actually doing this quite swiftly. You want to do it quite quickly. Now I'm using the curved side of the corner, and you can see I've got bigger marks there, so it's really effective. So I'm having a little play here, and I really encourage you to do the same, to practice this technique, because it is so useful. So I am using the corner of the card now, the sharp corner, and this time I'm scratching the surface, not lifting off the paint, but actually scratching the surface. And this is permanent. So I always say make sure you know where you want to scratch out these lines, because you can't remove the scratches. But what happens is when you scratch the surface of the paper to create these thin lines with the corner of the card, the paint, the watercolour paint, runs into that scratch and it creates some lovely dark lines. And it's really good for landscape painting when you want to paint stems or distant trees or even sort of grasses. You can actually scratch out. Just be careful that you don't sort of make a hole in the paper, so just scratch into the watercolour paper once. What I'm doing here is I'm actually lifting off again as well, so I've got lighter sort of thin marks there as well. It's so useful. Again, wait for the time to lift off. Don't lift off too soon, because the paint will run back in on itself. So I'm going to be experimenting now, and I really encourage you to experiment. It really builds up confidence and skills in watercolour painting and using these different tools. So I've got Indigo washi. You can use any dark. I've started off with the dark colour and I've added water at the bottom, so I've got a light area. I like to experiment actually dropping in water in there, and it creates backruns because the darker wash there isn't as wet as the water. So if you want to avoid backruns, make sure your paint consistency is the same or neater, drier than the actual paint on the paper. But I quite like experimenting with backruns to see what happens. It creates some lovely natural effects. As you can see here, I'm actually painting in neater paint, creamier paint as well, to create some darks. So now I'm scratching into the surface of the paper with the pointy bit of the plastic card to sort of paint some sort of winter trees. So it's quite nice to do, and it's really effective. And it's good for sort of abstract sort of painting as well, this. And again, I'm lifting out. So lifting off with that swift sort of swiping action. Again, make sure the timing is right, so you don't sort of lift off too soon, because all the paint will run back in. And now I'm sort of painting or scratching out some reflections as well, dropping in a little bit more water just to create some atmospheric effects and also some textures as well. You can get a little bit carried away, but it's only experimenting, so you can sort of find out the right and wrong ways of doing things when you're experimenting. And I sometimes go a little bit too far, but I quite like that, because then I sort of understand it a little bit more. So do have a go. So I like using a plastic card to paint buildings. So I'm just sort of painting an imaginary skyline here, and I'm wetting the sort of shapes that I've painted with my size 8 brush, just with some water. Now, you remember earlier I said I cut up little pieces of the card to fit into my pans. That's what I'm doing here. And remember, I squeeze out paint from a tube, so it's a lot more sort of moist, easier to work with, especially with this technique. So here I go. I've got my sort of pan fully loaded, and I'm just applying it now to the damp paper. And it really does create some really interesting effects. Left hand side is wetter, the right hand side it's dried off a little bit more. So it creates almost the effects of sort of skyscraper buildings there. You can sort of print with the side of the card there as well, pull down, create some lovely textures as well. And I've got some dark areas there, and I'm lifting off to create some lighter areas and textures. And I'm working here, swiping left to right. I'm also using the corner of the card here to create the look of windows there, just using some of the dark paint. I'm also using that sort of long side of the card there to look like cranes or something like that on the skyline. Got a lot of that in London at the moment. And I'm using the brush now to soften some of those darks. The paint's still damp and I'm just using it to paint some shadows on the left hand side here. So it's really effective in painting buildings. It makes it so much easier. I'm just sort of painting a little bit of water here, and now I'm actually going to print in some of the reflections as well. So I've dipped the side of the card into some sort of neat tube paint, and it dilutes onto the damp surface there and just creates the most amazing reflections. And I'm using the card to swipe as well to create some horizontal marks in the water. And I'm just now painting a sky wet in wet, just to sort of set the whole scene there, which is quite nice, and just softening some of those marks as well. And I'm actually blending some of that neat paint there as well, just on the water's edge, with my damp brush there just to finish off. Here's a painting that I did using a plastic card to paint Big Ben and the Houses of Parliament, and also some of the bridge as well, and the people, the road, and it just made painting the buildings especially so much easier. I've also used the card to paint these mountains here, and it was so much fun. It just sort of paints itself almost. It does take a little bit of practice, but as you can see, I've used them in the distance and in the foreground there, and it creates some wonderful textures as well. And here is a seascape scene I did with just using one colour. As you can see here, I've used the plastic card to create these rocks here on the right hand side. I've also used the plastic card to paint this London scene here, and with all these wonderful colours in this sort of semi-abstract painting. And also on this sort of mixed media seascape, I've used some gesso and also the plastic card to sort of paint the rocks in the distance as well as in the middle ground here. And it just really gives you that wonderful texture of those rocks in the sea. And I've used the plastic card here to paint the cliffs. I've not actually used very much, but just enough to give that impression there, especially in the sort of middle distance, and a little bit of grasses there in the foreground as well. I loved painting this abstract sort of cityscape scene using the plastic card. I'm giving you a close-up here. As you can see, I've used the side of the card. I've also printed with the card as well. And I've painted another London scene here. I love skylines, and again I've used very similar techniques that I actually demonstrated earlier here as well. And this is the Northern Lights, and I love the way the card created these sort of craggy dark rocks here. It's so effective to create darks and textures. And here's one I practiced in my sketchbook, just painting a skyline out of my imagination. So I will put a playlist in the description below of all the tutorials I have created using the plastic card technique. So I hope you find this helpful. I'm also publishing an exclusive tutorial for my patrons where I use the plastic card technique to create this rocky stream with the rocks surrounding it in the grasses. If you'd like to get access to exclusive tutorials, outline sketches, check out my Patreon membership. Details about that can be found in the description. And if you'd like to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel where you will get updates of my latest tutorials. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.